to introduce our panelists in a moment. Let me first just say a little bit about foreign affairs and a little bit about this topic, which we've been covering recently in our current issue. Foreign Affairs is a magazine published by the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. We're in our 97th year of publication. Our mission, essentially, is to bring authoritative expert analysis to a general audience on anything that's important and interesting and global in scope. We and many people in this room who work in the media or in academia can understand this, I think. We feel this mission has taken on renewed urgency in recent years, maybe especially in the last year, because we in the United States and elsewhere face something of an epistemic crisis. We're living in a post-truth era now, unfortunately, and those of us who are committed to trying to apply reason to public debate are finding more opposition to what we do than in recent memory, let's put it that way. So we're delighted to have an opportunity to kind of join forces with anyone, whether it's the European Council on Foreign Relations or any of the places that you all are affiliated with, who shares that mission, and we're happy to do that here in Berlin. This subject of this panel relates to the package that we have called the Undead Past, which is a collection of articles in the current issue. The idea here was, in the United States for the past, well, really for the past couple of centuries, but especially in the past year, there's been a really intense debate about memorials and monuments to the Confederacy. This is one small part of the larger debate that has constantly roiled American society and politics about race, about the legacy of white supremacy, about the Civil War. This is what the debate was in Charlottesville in the United States, where there was violence last year, and where our president declared that there were very fine people on both sides of this issue, which led to some consternation. At Foreign Affairs, we don't normally do domestic politics per se. We sometimes talk about it, we do write about it, but it's not our métier. But we thought this was a really important topic, and we thought that the way we could add value to it was by taking a look at how other countries have dealt with these issues. We're dealing with it now in the United States. As I was saying to some of our panelists before, you could plop yourself down in any country on earth and find a robust and divisive debate about the past and how to contend with it today. We chose, and it was hard to choose which ones to focus on, but we chose 6 cases that we thought showed an interesting breadth. We chose 2 cases of genocide, the German case and the Rwandan case. We chose 2 cases of long-term campaigns of ideological repression in the Soviet Union and in China. And then we chose 2 cases of similarly long-term institutionalized systems of racial persecution and oppression in the United States and in South Africa. And we tried to get some experts to tell us what was important and interesting about those things. We think we managed to do that, and we have some others here as well. So let me tell you who we are here, who's with us today, and then we can get into a conversation about some of this. Here to my immediate right is Phil Clark. Phil is a professor at SOAS, the School of Oriental and Asian Studies in London, and actually contributed to our package, did the piece on Rwanda, which is just an utterly fascinating case, and the most recent case we have at least. To his right, Nicholas Guyat. Am I saying it right? Is it Guyat?
Perfect.
Guyat, perfect. Excellent. Is at Cambridge and has written widely on foreign policy and also on the 18th and 19th century in the United States. And we're looking forward to some of his insights on the Charlottesville phenomenon as I was describing. To his right is Mary Fulbrook. Mary is professor at University College of London and one of the leading experts on this question of how Germany and Germans have reconciled themselves to the Nazi past. And finally, Franziska Exceller. Did I get it right? Not perfect. Okay. Franziska Exceller has a cross appointment. She's a postdoc at at Cambridge and also teaches here at the Free University in Berlin. Franziska is an expert on the Soviet history and a very particular expertise on a fascinating element of how the Soviet Union dealt with the history of its citizens' involvement with and collaboration with the Nazi regime during World War II and during the occupation of some of the Soviet territories by German forces. So that's a sort of field within a field almost. All right, well, let's jump in. What I want to do is, because Americans have a reputation for being sort of American-centric and self-centric, I'm going to completely confirm that stereotype. And I'm going to start the conversation actually with Nick. Nick, I want to ask you this. Look, in the past years I referred to, it's been, so many things have been shocking about America to Americans and I think to people abroad. One of them was this spectacle of white supremacists marching in the street and burning torches and defending Confederate statues and monuments as part of a larger, maybe white backlash or populist, nationalistic backlash against something. I wonder whether, watching this, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, as someone who, as an American who was born in the post-war era in the 70s, the story that most Americans, especially sort of coastal educated elites, are told about how America has dealt with its past is one of sort of not perfect and not totally linear, but progress. And I think in a lot of versions of that story, the election of Barack Obama is seen as the climax of that narrative of racial progress. Was that story wrong? Was it flawed in some way? Or was it fundamentally right? And what we're seeing now is kind of an aberration, or sort of the last gasp of a dying older order. Where do you land on that question?
Well, yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Yeah, I would say there is a narrative of racial progress in American history, which presupposes that all men are created equal. That ringing phrase from the US Declaration of Independence in 1776 has been kind of gradually extended to more and more Americans. So it begins with white men, and it expands a little by the, say, the 1810s, 1820s in the northern states, to include African Americans in terms of them being freed from slavery in the northern states. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, it gets bigger still as slavery ends in the southern states, and then in the 1960s it gets bigger again because of civil rights. And on that kind of, that upward vector, you could see Barack Obama as being the kind of summation of that process. The problem is that at every stage of the way, our marker of what counts as racial progress is highly political and in some respects unreliable. If you measure racial progress by asking if African Americans are held in slavery anymore, terrific. There's been wonderful racial progress in the United States. If you measure racial progress by whether African Americans are treated as equals, then things are a little more complicated. And somewhere in between those two things, and I think this is kind of the crucial metric, do you measure African Americans as having achieved equality with white people when the embedded, aggregated effects of slavery and of segregation have not been undone? And let me just answer that with a statistic. Right now, African American households have about a seventh of the wealth of white households on average. So you're 7 times more wealthy as an average white household than you are as an African American household. The median difference is 12 times. So actually, if you look at the actual numbers of African Americans, you can see wealthier African Americans kind of skew the statistic a bit. And why is that? Because of slavery, because of Jim Crow and Southern segregation, because of discrimination, because of redlining, the practice of preventing African Americans from living in certain neighborhoods, because of all manner of segregation and discrimination, even since the 1960s, the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, all of these elements of racism, most of them are not slavery, but all these elements of racism have created a huge wealth gap between African Americans and white people. So are African Americans in slavery? No. Have African Americans been able to overcome a history of racial oppression? No, but the game is rigged. And finding a way for states or for populations to undo the unfairness and the discrimination of history is an enormous challenge.
So that would be an interesting explanation of why there would be a movement or more radical kind of movement on the part of African Americans and other minorities. Why instead are we seeing, if that's the case, why instead are we seeing almost the reverse? Why now? Why this backlash now?
Well, I don't mean to be a race traitor, but white people have a way of congratulating themselves for not doing full justice to people who are not white at different moments in their history. There is an extremely self-congratulatory narrative in the American 19th century about white people's involvement in the end of slavery. And again, it comes back to this question of progress being an intensely political word. Ending slavery was a moral achievement or a moral advance. But unless you can find a way to narrow the huge gap created by slavery between white people and African Americans, you haven't completed the job. So the tendency for white people in the 1860s or in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, or after 2008 with the election of Barack Obama, to believe that the job is complete because slavery has ended, or you have civil rights legislation on the federal statute book, or you have a black president. These are all necessary conditions for racial progress, but they are not sufficient, nowhere near, and that's the problem.
Mira, that raises to me a link to Germany where this, what Nick said is sort of the job is done, that, you know, that we're finished now. I sometimes hear, in my sort of understanding of following contemporary German politics, I sometimes hear an echo of that sentiment in the rise of groups like Pegida or Alternative for Deutschland. Is there a similar, is that a similarity? Is part of what's backing these more far-right groups a similar kind of sense that enough now, we've sort of done our penance and it's time to move on?
I think the title that you gave this event, or you gave the particular journal issue, is very interesting, the Undead Past. And we have a sort of assumption that the past is history, it's in the past, it's gone, and we're somewhere else now. But actually, if you look at any historical conflict, it sets up imbalances that persist even in the post-conflict era. So I think what's happened in Germany is something very much more complex than the usual story. The usual narrative, which I'm afraid you get also in that issue, is West Germany indulges in obsessive memorialisation of victims. Now we've had enough of it, we can move on, or we must continue to memorialise victims so that we never forget this dreadful past. Those are the two takes on it. I think, however, it's much more complex because what happened in Germany is a massive upheaval with mass murder, mass injustice on an industrial scale of epic proportions, and that set up a lot of reverberations, only some of which were dealt with through memorialisation of victims. I think some of the issues have to do with inadequate recognition and compensation of some groups of victims, only very, very belated recognition of some of them. But I think some of the issues also have to do with inadequately dealing with perpetrators. Failures of the justice system in all three Third Reich successor states, so that former Nazis were, on the whole, rehabilitated, reintegrated. Very few were brought to court and convicted for what they'd done. And you have an undercurrent of persisting attitudes that have not been adequately addressed. There's an undercurrent of reverberations within families, across generations, and there is also a feeling that the national culture of shame, in some quarters, and this is Pegida and AfD, in some quarters a feeling that we've had enough of this national culture of shame, we want to be proud to be Germans again, or we want to keep foreigners out. I mean, there are whole variations on this. I don't need to talk to you as an audience presumably mostly resident in Berlin and living day to day with contemporary German politics. I don't need to talk about that in detail, but I think there are undercurrents coming which say we've had enough of the national culture of shame, we've had enough of, for example, Angela Merkel opening doors to all refugees, partly out of her own moral stance, partly out of the background of German history. And so there is a persisting tension which is still going on, and I think the past was never done with in Germany. I think West Germany, let me just be bold about this and provocative, and then you can argue and disagree, but I think West Germany has an ill-deserved good reputation for coming to terms with the past. I think West Germany did a fantastic trick of taking responsibility, taking the burden, the moral burden of shame, but at the same time ensuring that the vast majority of people who'd been complicit in Nazi crimes were reintegrated, rehabilitated, able to live new lives. I think it's different in East Germany, different in Austria, we can discuss the comparisons, but I think there were a lot of tensions that were left not adequately dealt with, and that's partly why there are persisting issues today. So the past is not history, the past is not dead, the past persists in new forms.
That raises, part of your answer raised a kind of perennial issue in looking at this, which is the tension between peace and justice, or between rehabilitation and prosecution. Phil, I want to turn to you because Rwanda actually is a fascinating example of really an attempt to not make that trade-off in some ways, at least the way that I see it. Can you describe for us a little bit of a very kind of basic primer on what Rwanda did after the genocide? Because it's a fascinating system that people actually don't know that much about, and that I think has some really interesting lessons, both good and bad, for elsewhere in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about it and tell us how it relates to that peace and justice equation?
I mean, Mary mentioned this issue of what you do with perpetrators and some of the negative legacies that are created when societies choose not to deal with perpetrators. Rwanda arguably is a case where there's been an almost total emphasis on the need to prosecute individuals who were complicit in the 1994 genocide. The particular mechanism that Rwanda used to deal with genocide cases was to prosecute something like 400,000 individuals through a community-based court system called gacaca. And I guess one of the revolutionary elements of gacaca was that it didn't really distinguish between those that we might consider high-level and those we might consider low-level perpetrators. The idea in Rwanda was that all levels of actors had played an absolutely key role in the perpetration of the genocide and therefore needed to be prosecuted for those crimes. International law tends to say we only have to deal with the top brass, we only have to deal with a small handful of evil masterminds of something like genocide. Rwanda said, well, in the case of our genocide, that logic doesn't really work because, in fact, hundreds of thousands of everyday people participated in these crimes, sometimes not even being coerced by their leaders. And a huge amount of research has shown that many everyday Rwandans took part in the killing spree for their own very personal and very collective motivations. And so if you were going to do justice for that kind of genocide, you had to wrestle with the involvement of everyday people. One of the other factors that Rwanda has had to deal with, and which I guess perhaps is arguably a little different from some of the other cases I think we'll talk about today, is that you were never, after the genocide, going to see the complete separation of the group that you might think of as the primary perpetrators, who in most cases were of the Hutu ethnicity, and the group that we may think of as the primary victims or the survivors of the genocide, namely the Tutsi. After the genocide, these groups were going to have to come back and live together. Rwanda is a very small, landlocked society. It relies almost exclusively on subsistence agriculture. These perpetrators couldn't be exiled into other countries or blockaded into particular parts of Rwanda itself. They were going to go back to the very same communities where they had committed crimes in 1994. And so one of the questions that absolutely obsessed the Rwandan government after the genocide was, what do we have to do to ensure that Hutu and Tutsi can go back and live on those densely populated hills with any sense of peace and prosperity? And the determination that was made, and I guess my own analysis, which I talk about in my piece in this latest edition of Foreign Affairs, is that ultimately I think that was the right choice. That there did need to be prosecution of even those so-called low-level everyday perpetrators, because if Rwanda had not done that, and these perpetrators had gone back onto the hills and were just living side by side with people that they had committed crimes against during the genocide without any kind of accountability that was commensurate to the crimes that they had committed, this would have created an absolutely volcanic situation. You would have seen anger and resentment increase on an unimaginable scale, and I think there's a very real likelihood that Rwanda would have seen, if not a repeat genocide, then at least something equivalent at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. So Rwanda took, I think, a very unusual and a very controversial line to really prosecute the entire backlog of genocide suspects, and it's been a messy process. You can imagine that 10 years of village-based trials was by no means a linear or predictable process. A lot of very negative unintended consequences emerged as these Gacaca trials took place. But in the bigger picture, I think ultimately this was a vital choice that Rwanda made. And it raises some very important questions, I think, about how important justice is, including prosecutions for those responsible for massive crimes, and how much that isn't just about the top brass. How much we also perhaps in other contexts need to think about what justice looks like for the foot soldiers, for the so-called everyday people who are almost always complicit in these mass atrocities as well.
I want to get to some of those unintended consequences later. But Francisca, I want to ask you, in some ways, Russia is in this particular group of countries an outlier in one particular way, which is that to varying extents and with varying degrees of success, in Germany and Rwanda definitely, and maybe unevenly in the United States, these are societies which have made a kind of concerted, very visible effort at the national level to sort of do the thing that we're talking about here, to confront, you know, parts of the past that are less than glorious. In contemporary Russia, let's say post-Soviet Russia, it's a slightly different story. And especially maybe today, in that the Soviet era, the way the Soviet era is dealt with, it's not quite, that effort isn't quite the same. Can you talk a little bit about, in general terms, what in post-Soviet Russia has been the, if any, the national level, sort of policy level approach to dealing with the Soviet era, and maybe in particular the Stalin era?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very important when we talk about, especially how complex this issue is, to understand that in Russia, questions of how the state, but also different groups within society, would deal with the Stalinist past, so the purges, the victims of famine as a result of collectivization, the gulag, through which an estimated 20 million people passed at some point. It's very important that these questions of dealing with the Soviet Stalinist past are also tied very much to the victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And that there exists an official narrative of that war victory, but it's also one that resonates, I think, in various different ways with many people. It has carries a lot of personal meaning for them in a society or in a state that made extremely tremendous sacrifices, and where on almost every family you will have somebody who was killed in the Second World War. So because of the centrality of the Second World War, the victory over Nazi Germany to post-Soviet Russian identity, it's impossible to totally renunciate the Soviet past, so because these are interconnected. So I think that's one problem here, that Stalin as the great victorious leader is hard to reconcile with then Stalin as the murderer. But the current, so Putin's government has also taken a very, it seems to me like a balancing line here in many ways, and that it's not that Stalin's crimes are entirely ignored or not mentioned at all, quite on the contrary, but it's an approach where euphemisms are used, where the government will speak about mistakes or tragedies instead of naming what kinds of crimes have been committed by whom. So, and there's a select playing also, I think, with that, in that for example, this fall, Putin unveiled a memorial to the victims of Stalinism, the Wall of Grief in Moscow. At the same time, prior to that, the only museum that was still sort of memorializing an actual Gulag complex, Perm 36, was closed down. So there is a constant tension in the sense that, on the one hand, there's an unveiling to the memorial of victims. On the other hand, the human rights organization Memorial that has had a significant role in making visible the crimes of Stalin is sort of constantly being still harassed by the by the Russian government, being called foreign agents. So I think there's that fine balancing of that. And very briefly, perhaps, I think there's this domestic issue of how it's a question of post-Soviet Russian identity, the war being also very much, I think, important in the 1990s when everything fell apart and people were looking for a new meaning that they could assign to their lives, perhaps, now that everything else had been devaluated in a way. So there's that domestic issue, but there's also always, I think, a more international sphere or dimension to that, in the sense that questions of how Russia deals with its Soviet past always linked to its relations to the other post-Soviet states, and we've seen this a lot in the conflict now with Ukraine, and also in how these countries deal with their Soviet past. So in the aftermath of the events, the Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014, we saw that people were pulling down Lenin statues in Ukraine. And Lenin statues sort of as a symbol of the Soviet past, but also then falsely taken as a representation of contemporary Russia. So the mistaken, sort of identifying the Soviet Union with Russia, which is historically incorrect. But that, in turn, we can see sort of memory politics playing out in Russia, where then the very diverse group of people, very different political opinions who were demonstrating were then all labeled fascist, and there was sort of a line of reference sort of made to the Ukrainian nationalists during the Second World War. And by labeling them fascist, then Russia can also legitimize its interference in Ukrainian politics and annexation of Crimea. So we can see how sort of the question of the Soviet past is tied to contemporary politics, to geopolitics, and sort of to questions of nationalism.
Let me ask you one question that I then want everyone else to weigh in on too, because it strikes me when I was going through this process of figuring out, what's important in this topic, the question of education keeps coming back up. And I'm really interested to hear from each of you your thoughts on this in each of your cases. In contemporary Russia, what do young people learn about the Stalin era, and how did they learn it?
Mm-hmm. I mean, at first, I think it does very much also depend on teachers. I mean, I think we shouldn't sort of overly stress or put differently. So the Russian government is not the Soviet Union. I think in the Soviet Union there was much more of a sense of being able to impose, the state had much more the means of imposing a much more coherent narrative, where obviously today in Russia that is different, and so there's a mix of authoritarian and democratic elements in that ways in which sort of the past is dealt with. But there was recently in 2013 a move of the governments towards standardizing textbooks and sort of to having that one more national or one coherent and standard national narrative. And as part of that, in many ways, sort of Stalin is certain generalizations here, but presented as sort of a figure where you would have both sort of good and bad, so to say. Again, like the good parts being linked to the Nazi victory over Germany, and then the bad parts obviously linked to, especially in the 1920s and the 1930s, but it is very much also linked to an image of a strict ruler, somebody who was sort of imposing order. So the question here is not just so much of, there's a question of what's being said and what's not being said, and then how what is being said is sort of presented very selectively. That, interestingly, also though refers to the warriors. I taught in Russia for a while, and my students there, who had just sort of come out of high school and were now taking university class, told me that they actually knew very little about the Second World War, which was surprising me tremendously, because I was assumed that, given the centrality of the war in public discourse, it would be so people would be very knowledgeable. But they said that they were taught in school, and several students confirmed with a very particular image of the Second World War, which was very much linked to learning the names of the generals and of the battles and who fought with whom, but sort of more, questions relating to the social experience of the war, for example, or also relating to questions of, can people that we overall describe as heroes, as sacrificing a lot for their country, can these same people also have committed war crimes? That these issues were sort of absent, and so again, I think it's very much a question also then tied to patriotic education, which is coming from the state, but in that very selective sort of
patriotic education being the name that they give to this sort of approach of yeah. What about in some of these other places? What role has education played in this? Of teaching young people about it to the extent that has happened at all? Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, Rwanda's taken post-genocide education extremely seriously and actually learned an enormous amount from both the German and the Israeli experiences. It took Rwanda about 14 or 15 years to decide how was it going to teach the history of the genocide, particularly to primary and high school students. And the Rwandan government sent all manner of delegations off to both Germany and Israel to learn about the education practices around the Holocaust. And what you've seen over the last sort of 8 or 9 years in Rwanda is a country that was not sure how to teach this, then moving to a total education of the entire population.
It wasn't just young people, right? Even adults.
Indeed. So not only have you had the school education, but you've also had this other practice called Ingando, which are these civic education camps that every single Rwandan adult has been through now. It's in many ways a very coercive practice. But the government, looking at these other cases around the world, I think decided that if you were going to try to tackle the ideological underpinnings of the genocide, then you needed some kind of civic education to tackle that. But in doing so, I think the government created another problem, which is it taught an education that was very much geared towards creating a new Rwanda. And so one of the key modules in this civic education is to say to Rwandans, in essence, the genocide wasn't your fault. The reason that Hutu and Tutsi are being pitted against one another isn't because of some obvious enmity between these two groups. It's basically the Belgians' fault. It's all about the colonial powers. It's all about how foreigners came in, meddled with our very peaceful situation and destroyed this historical unity that we've always enjoyed. So the answer that the government tries to give now is if Rwandans can just regain that historical unity, then everything will be peaceful in the future. That's been an absolutely central message in this education program. And much of that, I guess, is laudable. There is a national identity. There's an attempt to try to go beyond ethnic division. But you try sharing that education with the 400,000 individuals who've been prosecuted through Gacaca over the last 10 years. Those individuals are saying, well, if it wasn't really my fault, if this genocide was only the fault of outsiders, why have I been put through this very arduous community-based justice program, in some cases prosecuted, in some instances sent back to these horrific jails, or, if not, 5 or 6 years of pretty hard labour at the community level? That looks like the very same government is telling me that I am personally responsible for this genocide. This issue of individual complicity is absolutely central. So in trying, I think, to engage in a very comprehensive response to the genocide through things like justice and education, the Rwandan government has often given very conflicting messages. And in my fieldwork in rural Rwanda, this comes up as a constant complaint, especially in Hutu families and Hutu communities, a sense of we're not really sure how the government sees us, and we're a little bit confused about even how we should understand our own complicity here.
Well, that's a very centralized approach, and I wonder whether Mary or Nick, I think Germany and the US would offer very, very different stories here, but to the extent that you want to, what about education in those places around these issues?
Okay, well, again, German audience here, so what should I say to you? I think it's incredibly complex. If we look back over the last 80 years on, since the end of the Third Reich, re-education of the adult population probably made very little difference compared to the economic miracle in West Germany, changing people's attitudes. The majority of West Germans in the 50s still thought Hitler was a great statesman. It's only when economic miracle took off that they started thinking democracy was a good idea. If you look at education, I think it actually, in some respects, the content of teaching on the Third Reich to some extent mirrors the content or the profile of war crimes trials. I was very struck when you said 400,000 people were put on trial in Rwanda. If you think about Germany, 160 people were investigated and 6,000 put on trial and less than 5,000 convicted of serious Nazi crimes. There were a lot of convictions in the early years after the war of minor crimes, but if we look at major crimes, so proportionately, that dimension is completely different. Now, how does that relate to education? Very, very crudely, let me just grotesquely simplify.
It's good, we like grotesque simplification.
Grotesquely simplify. You talk about the nasty men at the top, everybody beginning with H, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, etc. Just a few nasty people who then give orders and everybody else is only obeying orders. That parallels the war crimes trials kind of defence mechanism. West Germany, this emphasis on what a dreadful dictatorship, so that young people growing up knowing something truly ghastly in their past, but it doesn't match up with family stories. The disjunction in West Germany between the private tales told in families or the silences in families and the huge emphasis on never again, and that particularly from the late 70s onwards, I think this changes over time, quite different in the 1950s from the 1980s. But West Germany, the emphasis on this dreadful past, and then trying to understand how grandma enjoyed being in the Bunddeutsche Mädel, or grandpa did good stuff on the Eastern Front, but never did anything nasty and certainly never killed a Jew. These private tales, I think there's a disjuncture which makes education quite difficult. If you look at East Germany, it's a heck of a lot easier for the second generation. The East German official narrative of pride in the anti-fascist state means that a lot of younger East Germans in the 1980s never had a shred of a sense of inherited guilt, completely different to West Germany. And you get talk in the 1990s of people saying, I assumed everybody's grandfather was Jewish or in the resistance or against Hitler, and surprised to find there had been people with Nazi families in school. Now, I have a very individual example of what difference this makes. I interviewed a year or so ago the son of a Nazi war criminal in East Germany. This was a man who had been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in East Germany, that in fact died in prison for murdering 106 Jews in a particular area of Poland. I went to interview his son, thinking this would make a really interesting comparison, because we have all these sons of perpetrators in the West agonising about their fathers. What was it like for someone who grew up in the GDR? I've read through all the archival files and so on. I go in, and I was just amazed, I was speechless. I'd got my questions prepared, and this guy did not know his father had done anything wrong. He did not know that what his father had been accused of and sentenced for was true. His mother had told him and the family, and this was the family tale, that this was just der Unrechtsstaat, this was just Stasi pursuing show trial and so on. And this guy had grown up without a shred of guilt or worry about his father being a mass murderer. Now, I asked myself after that discussion, which was very, very interesting, I asked myself, actually, was it much easier for the second generation who were not guilty to not feel a sense of burden of the past in some way? To grow up feeling a sense of moral responsibility for making a better world today and in the future, but not to feel weighed down by hang-ups about what their parents or grandparents may or may not have done. So it's very, very interesting the difference it makes to the second generation, and I think it would be very difficult to summarise neatly in 3 sentences the differences in education in East and West, but it's complex.
But you raise actually an interesting point that makes me again think of the American case where, and Nick, I think you've written about this actually, it's a different mechanism. What you're talking about is the East German sort of narrative allowing many people to kind of be fairly oblivious about the past. There's a similar phenomenon actually in the United States, and I think you know what I'm getting at, which is you have lots of people. The most dramatic example to me is sometimes there's a show called Roots, which is hosted by Henry Louis Gates Jr., where they go back and sort of they take a celebrity and they go back and trace their heritage. And again and again, there are these white celebrities who are shocked to discover that, oh, it turns out that my great-great-grandfather was a slave owner, and then in fact there's this, and then similarly less shocked, but some black celebrities discover, oh, it turns out that there's these white people in my family because guess what? There was some intermixing there. I want to hear from you about this issue, about about the inability sometimes to grapple with complicity.
I think all national histories which are effective, and I use that term in a kind of morally neutral way, effective national histories are brilliant at compartmentalization, right? They can think about people or think about places or moments in one context and kind of secure that from another context. So in the United States, a really good example would be the Founding Fathers. 4 of the first 5 people to become presidents of the United States were slaveholders. None of them freed their slaves in their own lifetime. All of them, in their own way, helped to rivet, to harden the system that perpetuated slavery through the 1860s. They're on the money, they're on the bills, you see them on the portraits. What do you do about that? Well, they're not seen as slaveholders, particularly by white Americans, right? In a way, we've found a way to kind of sanitize them or treat slavery like a filter that we can peel off and then we can still see them without it. And I think that that's kind of a massive problem, figuring out how you undo that. There's no easy way to go about undoing that unless you make slavery completely central. And I'll just say this, listening to what other people have said about recompense or compensation. No slaveholder in the United States, so of the hundreds of thousands of slaveholders in the United States, no slaveholder was ever prosecuted for the crime of holding another human being in slavery. And no slave was ever compensated. Some of you may know the phrase 40 acres and a mule, which is often bandied around to talk about what African Americans got after the end of slavery in 1865. They didn't even get the 40 acres and a mule. They didn't get the mule. So we're in a historical space in which you have nobody prosecuted for the crime of slavery and nobody compensated for suffering the crime of slavery. And we have these figures in American history who are foundational both to the creation of the United States and to the maintenance of slavery, and we can't find a way to put them together, or maybe we don't want to find a way.
Isn't one of the things that's come up in the American debate about this, right, though, is that, and President Trump, in fact, has engaged in this line, which is to say, okay, well, you've just said, 4 of our first 5 presidents were slaveholders, they're on the money, they are part of our national myth, so if we start taking down monuments of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate leader, and we start taking down monuments of Jefferson Davis, why not take down all the statues of George Washington? Why not, and I think there are various answers to that. What's your response to that? I think kind of provocative, but tough to completely dismiss with criticism.
I would like us to have a conversation about that, but let me just say this, that very often when one hears politicians or commentators, columnists, TV opinion people talking about the question of the morality of the past, something you will hear persistently is this old line that you cannot judge the past by the morals of the present. Now, on some level, I'm no longer teaching that individual in schools. And I think that difference between memorialization and remembering needs to be preserved. So I think if there is a debate about particular slaveholders, if you're a kid who goes to Thomas Jefferson High School and you're African American, have you a right to be upset about that? I think maybe you do. So there's a debate to be had there. But if we did decide to rename the school, I don't see that as erasing history. I see that as correcting this problem of memorialization. And listen, there are a lot of great people in the past, including the recent past, that we're not remembering right now by naming schools after them. So I'm in favor of mixing things up. Let's remember some other people if we have to. There are plenty of people in the past worth remembering.
I've got two more questions, and then that I want to kind of explore with you, and then I want to open things up to the audience here and let them ask you some questions. The first one is kind of broad, but I think it's something that's run through our conversation so far. When you think about efforts to confront the past, whether they're energetic and maybe over-energetic in some cases, or whether they are kind of ambivalent at best, like in Russia, how should we understand the role of the state versus the role of civil society to the extent that it exists? Is there, and in these cases, is there tension between state-led efforts to do this and sort of top-down and bottom-up? Ideally, in these cases, are there any lessons about the tension there? Anyone want to take that? Sure.
I mean, I'll jump in because I guess Rwanda is an extreme case of state-led reckoning with the past. And I think one of the issues that Rwanda throws up, at least in terms of African societies that are dealing with mass conflict, is that I think you do need the state to kickstart this process of reckoning. There's something very important about governments being able to act on a national scale in a way that other actors simply can't. And I think in a society like Rwanda, given that the genocide had affected the entire nation, you needed the Kagame-led government to, in many ways, take responsibility for accounting for the past. And it was the state, I think, that was able to put in place a wide range of practices, education, justice, socioeconomic development, that tried to tackle the legacies of conflict from multiple angles. And again, it would be difficult to imagine civil society organisations, NGOs, being able to tackle conflict in this kind of multi-directional sense. But I think also what the Rwandan case shows, and I think again this is important especially for other societies in Africa that are dealing with mass conflict, is that states are often part of the problem. It's often states themselves that have been extremely repressive, that have been the perpetrators of some of the key atrocities. And what we've seen in the Rwandan case is that the state, I think, has now gone too far in trying to deal with the legacies of the genocide. It's particularly become too intrusive in the lives of everyday citizens. And this is a constant complaint that I hear in my interviews in Rwanda. And I'm going back to Rwanda tomorrow for 3 months, and I'm sure this refrain will come up in my interviews in rural areas consistently. We needed the government at the beginning to start to put in place some of these key post-genocide programs, but we really wish that we had more breathing space now. There are too many government interventions, there are too many government practices, and given the trauma and the very personal legacies of the genocide, a lot of people now simply want to be left alone.
Is that related to Kagame's attempt, sort of post-genocide, to consolidate control and his sort of quasi-democratic, but maybe increasingly autocratic style? Is part of that narrative a lever for him?
Absolutely. And in the Rwandan case, dealing with the legacies of the genocide is always wrapped up in the current politics of the country. And so it's not even, I think, that Kagame is becoming more autocratic. He's been autocratic from day one. This has been an enormously autocratic state. And that's one of the paradoxes of Rwanda, is that I think that even a very controlling, sometimes very repressive state, in many respects has actually done some extremely important work in dealing with the genocide. The thing that I think many international donors struggle with a case like Rwanda is, isn't it supposed to be good liberal democracies that do the best job in reckoning with the past and dealing with the legacies of mass conflict? Actually, I think what we've seen in places like Rwanda and to a certain extent Ethiopia is that it's often highly orchestrated, highly controlling states that have the power to deal with the past in a much more comprehensive, much more systematic fashion than a range of other states that are sometimes distracted by things like elections and all the kind of accoutrement of democracy, if you like. This is not an attempt to justify the kind of draconian tendencies of Kagame's government. It's just to say that I think there has been something about state control that has been very, very important to Rwanda recovering in the way that it did. And if you had a less organised, less orchestrated state, it probably wouldn't have been capable of that. This is a very unpopular thing to say, especially in many European capitals. It's a very unpopular thing, especially to say to international donors. But I do think that Rwanda shows that you can have, in some respects, often a very authoritarian state that does a very comprehensive job of dealing with the past.
Does anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about the German case, because you've got so many different fractions of it after the war, it was state-sponsored, state-initiated mass violence in the Third Reich, and states had to deal with that after the Third Reich, the successor states. This is where the issue of how much justice is done and how much rehabilitation, reintegration becomes so important. Because if you look at West Germany in the 1950s, who is the state? They are explicitly against Nazism and denouncing the Nazi past, and yet many, many people at the highest levels in Adenauer's government had tainted, contaminated pasts. And it was actually very much a question of international relations that to some extent helped push West Germany into bringing people to trial against considerable internal opposition. So if you look at history of attempts at compensation, the state for decades wasn't prepared to recognise Sinti and Roma. People had been persecuted, gay men had been persecuted on grounds of sexuality. It took a long time for the state to actually shift its position on that. And I think when you talk about the state, you have to really build in the people, the generations. It's with generational change in the 70s, 80s, 90s and beyond that things really start to shift and change. And in the early decades, the state is to some extent going very slowly. The judiciary has huge continuity with the Third Reich. East Germany, quite different, autocratic state, very top-down, very heavy and very, very communist-dominated, obviously. So a quite different approach to it. But that leads to the apparent imposition of a view that is not bought into by the vast majority of the population. So it doesn't necessarily produce an easier outcome instantly.
Yeah,
I think in Russia you can also see how difficult it is for sort of civil society or different groups within civil society to be heard if the state is pursuing what to me seems like quite smart strategies of providing certain kinds of outlets for critical voices, but then making sure that sort of for instance, the TV, like the main, one of the main ways and probably the most important ways through which people receive information throughout Russia, that TV is sort of something that has a heavy sort of state hand or sort of heavy state control in there, or is in line with the sort of official policy. So in a way, it's different from it's different from a dictatorship like the Soviet Union, where again you had a much heavier state or hand of the state, like in East Germany. But you kind of provide these outlets, the internet, places for people to meet in Moscow and Petersburg to discuss sort of critical issues of the past, but making sure that there is that sort of that dynamic within society, but at the same time sort of keeping or trying to keep as much sure that that doesn't spill over and become sort of mainstream opinion, and having certain sort of strategies in place. And I think history education in schools matters tremendously for that, for ways in which states deal with that past, or the kind of narrative that they want to write. Academia, universities, I'm always afraid to say probably a little bit less so, in the sense that, I mean, one of the experts on sort of the history of Stalinism and Stalin personally is a Russian historian, Oleg Khlevnyuk, and with him sort of, there are many other academics in Russia who've done fantastic sort of work, and so the research is all there. The question is just how do you connect it to sort of present day debates, and I think there again, like there's this question of how can that kind of research then be translated into schools, and I think there's a huge disconnect. So.
This is my last question for you, and it's really, I'm going to ask you all to respond to this. We've been having this conversation, and we had the conversation on our pages with a certain presumption that there may be different ways of remembering the past or dealing with the past. Some may be more effective than others, some may have worked better than others, but the attempt is sort of worthwhile. And I want to present a counterpoint, actually, and see what you think of this. The American writer David Reef wrote a book a few years ago called In Praise of Forgetting. And in part, he wrote the following. He said, "Remembrance, however important a role it may play in the life of groups and whatever moral and ethical demands it responds to, carries risks that at times also have an existential character. During wars or social and political crises, the danger is not what the American historian Yosef Yaim Yerushalmi called the terror of forgetting, but rather the terror of remembering too well, too vividly. These are cases in which it's possible that whereas forgetting does an injustice to the past, remembering does an injustice to the present. On such occasions, when collective memory condemns communities to feel the pain of their historical wounds and the bitterness of their historical grievances, it is not the duty to remember, but a duty to forget that should be honored." What do you make of that? Anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah, that's nuts. Don't agree with that in the slightest. Fine, forget, but look around you and see your economic or your material circumstance, the neighborhood you live in, the school your kid might go to, completely conditioned by your historical experience. I think actually a better way to think about this is which version of remembering we want to do. And I mentioned this the other day to Justin, but back in 2015, Barack Obama gave one of his finest speeches at the 50th anniversary of the Selma Civil Rights March in Alabama. And Obama's strategy in that talk was, in effect, to invite all Americans to share in the inheritance of all the strands of American history. So Obama said that everyone was the heir to the people who built the White House, the slaves who built the White House. Everybody was the heir to Thomas Jefferson. Everybody was the heir to the cowboys. Everybody was the heir to the Cherokee Indians. So this kind of sense of almost racial and political universalism, as if we were all kind of multiracial in terms of our historical experience. And there's something incredibly beguiling about that, because it presupposes that that kind of delta of racial experiences has now met the kind of ocean of the present, and it's a just ocean, right? You know, it's an ocean of equality.
The arc of history.
Well, right, yeah, the arc of history bends towards justice. And in many respects, that's such a powerful political narrative, and so preferable to the stuff that Trump has said, which I'd be delighted to talk about in the question period. But the stuff that Trump has mentioned is so disgusting and disgraceful by comparison. It's tempting to see that Obama language as a happy refuge for us now. If only we could get Obama to say those things again. I'm not sure that those things solve the problem. I can see the power of assuming this shared history, but in a way I don't think we can actually unlock that shared history until we confront people's different relationships to it. So I think actually the question is not whether you remember or whether you forget, but how you remember.
All right, why don't we...
Yes,
please, of course, yes.
Yeah, I think the question presupposes that you're thinking about something which is really past, and the whole point is it's not past. The sense of persisting injustice continues, and it's very easy to forget something which didn't really affect you badly, but it's almost impossible to forget something where you're still suffering from the persisting legacy of it, in the case of the slavery you've just mentioned. But I'm thinking about, for example, Holocaust survivors who were completely devastated, who had lost everything, who had lost their homes, their families, their communities, who were physically and psychically devastated and wounded, and it comes back in their nightmares. They cannot have the choice of forgetting. And if they are then denied compensation for their time working in labour camps, in ghettos, in concentration camps, and they see civil servants in Germany sitting on fat pensions or fat salaries, it's very difficult to say, yeah, it'd be nice to forget the past, because we are still suffering and they are not. And that persisting sense of injustice is why remembering and forgetting is the wrong terminology to talk about. It's an attempt to rectify the continuing legacies of persecution and inequality.
That's a good way to think of it. Yes, well, we're going to open up to questions now, and I would just ask anyone who wants to ask a question, please ask a question. We want to get our panelists' voices, and please try to keep it fairly short so that we can have time for everyone who wants to have a chance. Joseph, do you want to start with the question?
Yes, I'm wondering, after everything that we've gone through, and everything we learned, and everything we understand about the presence of the past, about ethno-religious, racial conflict and warfare, how come that we find ourselves incapable of dealing with situations of post-conflict reconstruction in places like Bosnia, where basically it rings bells of so many of the conflicts that have been researched so intensively, and yet it doesn't work. Now, apparently, an outside interference is either not good enough, or it has not been good enough, or is inappropriate in order to deal with something like that. Now, we could take the Rwandan case and say, well, we haven't had that. Now, we have a similar situation of people not being able to return, but would have to return, but we don't have such a process. No, but we have all that wisdom, we have all that insight, and yet, history repeats itself in different places as if there's no learning.
What do you think? Anyone want to take a stab at the
You
answer?
mean the actual bringing up sort of the reasons why a certain conflict comes up, or whether a war started? You mean the ways of dealing with that?
Look at Bosnia today. Sarajevo is one of the most depressing places in Europe, because you can see that basically there is no healing, there is no reconciliation, there is no real future for young people, there is no way back to either even a parallelism of ethnic communities. No, it doesn't. You know, there is no turning towards a future because the past is basically not done with, and there's no. You know, you can probably explain it better than I can, but apparently people seem to be stuck in that situation beyond their will.
Mm. I mean, I'm not an expert on sort of former Yugoslavia. I've done a little bit of sort of reading on that, and it seems to me that one of the things, I mean, we've talked about criminal prosecution as being an important element, but at the same time there's also sort of research that shows that criminal prosecution itself is not enough, and often, quite on the contrary, criminal prosecution itself does not lead to social reconstruction, but what is needed is a sort of multi-factor or an approach that takes into consideration very different levels of society, and that also does a lot of work within communities. You know, whether that means speaking about the past. It also requires such things as economic stability, of course, but that trials themselves are often that it's not the purpose of the trial to bring about healing. Like if healing at all is possible, you know, and that's another question. Then it is something that is a very slow process. It's very dependent on quite sort of highly individual or the individual circumstances, on your experiences, on your social support network, on your relations to your neighbors. But it's actually much more of a question of society than it would be of a criminal justice system. So this is, I'm sure, especially in Rwanda, that would speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that entirely. I mean, clearly I'm not a Balkan specialist, but one thing that strikes me with the Bosnian case is how much of the response to the conflict of the past was dictated from the outside, and how much that continues to structure life today. I mean, there are two big factors there. I think one is the Dayton process, which politically structures these states in certain, you know, sort of ethnically divisive ways, if you like. And the other one is this imposition of international criminal justice. And it seems that those two factors have really sucked the life out of a whole lot of justice, reconciliation, and healing dimensions on the ground. And I would agree with Francisco entirely. I think one of the things that strikes me looking at the Rwandan case is that, you know, one of the best things that the state could do was to create the conditions in which a whole range of other actors in society could then in their own way start to deal with the past. And I think we've often seen that state suffocate the environment. It's become way too dominant. But nevertheless, we have seen communities and individuals starting to deal with the past. And my sense is, having only spent a limited time in the Balkans, that there's been less space for that. I think one of the big things we talk about in much of the academic literature at the moment is the relational element of conflict, and how important it is one-on-one and collectively for people to start to grapple with the ways in which relations were broken in conflict. That it's about social bonds, it's often even about interpersonal relations. That's where so much of the damage is done. And orchestrating the state and doing international criminal justice isn't going to touch that dimension of people's lives. It may be important, but it's never going to be sufficient on its own. And so we do need to see that this other level of society starting to come to terms with the past in this more personal, individual, collective, relational sense. And my scant understanding of the Balkans case suggests to me that there hasn't been a great deal of emphasis on that level because the kind of macro, political and legal has dominated the responses.
Any questions? Yes, ma'am. Please just tell us who you are as well, so we know.
I'm ambassador of Finland here in Germany, Riikka Koukuroinen. Thank you for very highly interesting discussion. I was actually having a little bit similar kind of question with Dr. Channing, coming to the lessons learned actually of history. Somehow we seem to repeat, although history doesn't repeat itself, but we seem to repeat and never learn of history. So if you think about and since we are in Europe now, in Berlin, if you think about the challenges we have at the moment with democracy or populism or the conflicts or the not actually reacting in sort of pre-reacting in some conflicts, which we have all the knowledge actually to react if we were wise enough somehow, or particular circumstances where, what would be your lessons learned if you would like to take one really thing of the history in your field which you would like to repeat and put it to the practice now, to give an advice to Mrs. Merkel, or giving really advice which would make change in Russia for Mr. Putin, or maybe giving advice to Finnish president, really elected just president. I would also wish that historians would have even more. There is a lot of sort of historians looking at these sort of very difficult periods of the time that we have, for instance, for decades already had some cooperation with Russian historians to look at some of the difficult periods of our common history and trying to get a common analysis on that. I think this kind of work is highly important. Just an advertisement, our former foreign minister have established also a network of historians without borders and try to stimulate this kind of discussion also. But I'd like to hear from your sort of, what as historians you are thinking that what should we primarily learn from history? One thing, advice to somebody or the world leader you think who should hear you.
Who'd like to start yet?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. I think the big thing I would take out of the Rwandan experience over the last 15 or 20 years would be for outsiders not to impose templates or models on societies of how to deal with these conflictual histories. I think especially in the last couple of decades, I think the globe has been dominated by these kind of one-size-fits-all templates. We absolutely have to have prosecutions. We absolutely have to have truth commissions. We absolutely have to rush to elections after conflict. I think what the Rwandan case shows, specifically if you look at these Gacaca community courts, was this, to a certain extent, has worked in Rwanda, but because it was contextually specific. It came out of a set of principles and practices that resonated inside that society, that made sense to local people. And Rwanda did it in absolute opposition to the international orthodoxies. International donors, international lawyers, especially international human rights groups, were saying to Rwanda, you can't do justice like this. You can't have Gacaca. It's not how we do things now. Rwanda basically gave the big finger to the international community and said, we don't care. We're going to do it this way. What I fear increasingly is that there is insufficient flexibility for societies to determine on their own terms how they're going to deal with their conflict. In the justice realm, because of the advent of the International Criminal Court, we now have a global justice template that is, I think, limiting the scope for societies to determine what their own justice approaches are going to look like. I think that is a massive problem. So I think what I would be calling for is more context-specific approaches, more flexibility, more latitude for societies on their own terms, with the assistance of the international community, but determining these things in a way that makes sense to them and that is geared towards the very specific conflicts that they have experienced. I think that's the big thing for me that comes out of the Rwandan case.
I don't know what I would advise President Trump. Probably say some things.
Well,
Well, yeah, say some things that get me in trouble. President Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," is a fascinating one for a historian. Because if you think about the experience of any person of color in American history and look into a moment in the past, the 1960s, the 1950s, actually, frankly, women. I mean, what is it, 20% of the US Congress, 15% in 1980, it's female, maybe it's even lower than that. I mean, throughout American history, if you're not a white man, the greatness of America is a somewhat difficult concept to celebrate. So on the one hand, one thing leaders could do is think about every person in their society, not just people who date back hundreds of years and have been living there, but the very newest member of your society as well, and to think about the strength of braiding all of those histories, or at least considering all those histories as part of the national story. And one other thing I'd say, I'd be very nervous about thinking of leaders as the people who should actually be leading this historical agenda. There's a way in which this conversation can seem quite pessimistic about the power of the past and the indomitability of the past. All of you who are professors or students or in the media, or any role that involves communication, you have this power to be a historian. I don't believe that history is some professional guild that everyone else is locked out from. We all have the power. And if I think about what's changing my field of American history, it's people of colour, it's women insisting, for example, my students, look at your reading list. Every single book on this reading list is by a man. What's going on with that? You know, and you look at it and you're like, you're absolutely right. And those kinds of insights of representation and diversity and breadth, you can push the experts, you can push the leaders, and this has to come from the bottom up as well as the top down.
Mary, any lessons learned from Germany, for Germany?
I wish I had a simple answer. I think since June 2016 I've been more depressed than I've ever been in my entire life about the course of history.
Okay.
The current situation in Germany, as you all know, is incredibly interesting. I just hope that Angela Merkel manages to pull something together, but that's a political statement. I guess Germany, for all my critical remarks about Germany earlier today, I think Germany is an absolute beacon of light in the darkness of the last 18 months in Britain and the States. And I think the fact that so many people have been applying for German citizenship to remain within the EU, so many British people of former German extraction, for example, and elsewhere have been applying to get dual nationality to stay in Germany, is an evidence of the fact that Germany's been doing a heck of a lot that is really right to actually have a debate about moral issues, to have a debate about very difficult issues, because we are living in a different world now. The issue of learning from history, you have to remember that the wider context is constantly changing, and I think the world of conflicts in the Middle East, refugee crises, transnational terrorism is quite different from the Cold War world or the Second World War and previous world. So one of the things is we have to constantly have an eye to how things are shifting and not think just within narrow national borders about the past and what we're doing about it. So I don't think there are any easy answers other than heightened moral vigilance and enhancement of analytic capacities, because I do believe in experts and I do believe in debate.
I pretty much entirely agree with sort of what fellow speakers have said. I think perhaps I would, ask a question, and then that wouldn't necessarily only be a question to a government like Putin's government, who sort of has a particular, or wants to, control a particular, put forth a particular kind of perhaps less complicated version of the past, but it would also apply to, certain groups within a society like Pegida or the AfD or whoever, else might hold on to that. It seems to me at the core of some of these of the question of why do we sometimes have such a hard time of coming to terms with the past, or dealing with the past, approaching, talking about the past, it seems to me is that question that Mary also raised, which is the reconciling the fact that someone who was a loving grandfather and very kind to his grandchildren also committed atrocities and murdered and killed other people. Or that the soldier could have been both heroic and at the same time also, again, committed war crimes. And so to live with that, to deal with that question seems to me is for some people very difficult. And I guess because it's personal. Personal in a direct sense, or personal because it becomes a question of nationalism. And nationalism can be a very personal thing for some people, very much tied up to their identity, even if they're not personally affected by it. So, these questions like a grandfather. So it seems to me like, I guess the question I would pose is like, why? Like, why is it that sometimes some of these narratives, provide such sanitized versions of human beings who, despite the fact that they commit these atrocities, we have to live with the fact that they're human beings. And why is it that question seems to be sometimes difficult to confront?
Yes, in the back. Yes, please tell us who you are and let us know what you'd like to know.
From Myanmar. I'm not going to ask a question regarding the genocide in Myanmar, but it's a question regarding the UK. During my time in Oxford, I was part of the campaign Roads Must Fall, which originated in South Africa, and we then brought it to Oxford to say we need to start celebrating people like Cecil Rhodes, one of the architects of apartheid in South Africa. We faced tremendous backlash, not only by our own university, but by the whole UK public. And I think if I'm not mistaken, a recent poll showed that more than every second person in the UK is very proud of the empire, and people are not dealing with the genocides and the atrocities related to the empire. And why is that? Can you maybe give me some more insights? Where's that came from?
I mean, that's a particular case and an interesting. I mean, I agree absolutely with what you said about Cecil Rhodes and the monuments and about the problem. I mean, I don't know if my fellow folks who lived in Britain would agree, but I think Britain has so many problems with its relationship to empire. One of the major ones is a kind of liberal, progressive understanding of empire as this thing that brought civilization to the world, which in all kinds of ways empirically is false, but which kind of survives. But in a way, maybe this is a good example of a broader point. This comes back to something that you raised initially, which is the issue of what remembering is. If you think about conflict and if you think about injustice, generally speaking, they're radical forms of redistribution. So in my patch, African Americans effectively are losing their labor, losing their lives, losing their wealth to white people. Native Americans losing their land, losing their labor. In India, people losing their livelihood to Britain. In a way, there are kind of three positions for Britain or for the United States to take. You can forget, you can remember, and you can redistribute. And in the United States, remembering is kind of secure, although some people still want to forget. In Britain, we're somewhere between forgetting and remembering, and maybe even closer to forgetting on the empire. And it's a massive, massive problem. We need to move the dial towards actually making recompense. And I don't know how we get there unless we just keep talking about it.
I mean, just on Rhodes Must Fall as well. I mean, I saw this both the Cape Town version and the Oxford version, and both were, I think, so important to observe. I mean, one was that we wouldn't have had the Oxford version if it hadn't been for the South African manifestation of this. So in many ways, it was ideas about the problems of colonialism and empire being transported from the colony back to the metropole, which I thought in and of itself was very important. But there was something actually very powerful about Rhodes. I mean, I say this too as a Rhodes scholar who benefited very directly from Rhodes's legacy. So I've got a stake in. I'm married to a South African as well, so I've got various stakes in this. But you know, broadly, my instinct is always, I think, in many ways, to agree with you, Nick. Something you said earlier about we should, in many cases, leave statues and monuments up because they also can be a prod and a reminder. And I know your position is more nuanced than that.
That's not my position.
But in the case of Rhodes' statue at Cape Town, there was something, I think, so transformative and so liberating about that statue being brought down. It was the action of that I think, you know, not just sent shockwaves through the university, but nationwide. In the Oxford case, in many ways, I think Rhodes' statue needs to remain because it is so obliterated from the history of that town that without the statue, Oxford, I think, is in grave danger of just disappearing into a kind of amnesia about that past. So it's the same phenomenon, but I actually think the two different manifestations of it were extremely important. The legacy for Oxford now, which I think would not have happened if it had not been for your campaign and the very courageous stance that the students took, was that we have seen now, it's quite remarkable for Oxford, but the selection of 3 very senior black African academics in the last 12 months. That doesn't sound like a lot, it's a lot in a place like Oxford. And it would not have happened if it wasn't for that campaign. The challenge for Oxford now is to take that on board in a much more systematic way in terms of student recruitment, staff recruitment, and the university, I think, really fully coming to terms with, you know, its own embeddedness within the imperial project. It's nowhere near that yet, but this is a very important start, I think.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am on the left, just tell us who you are and please ask.
My name is Satyaga Piper. I've been working for the United Nations in numerous countries. I would be interested if you had any chance to distribute or connect with the government. I don't know, for example, is Kigame open for your observations or not? Or is your research going into research only in courts? I mean, it would be very interesting, I would think, for the government, hopefully, to take on some of your observations. Is that the case? Do you have some advisory role? Probably not, you are a researcher. But I think it would be great if the government would know about your work. I mean, if you have spent so much time.
How open is the regime there?
The government.
receptive to reading, surprisingly I would say receptive to reading academic work, which doesn't happen with governments very often, but I would say very reluctant to acting on it. So I find that in Rwanda, you know, if you can take your findings and you can communicate them, you know, not aggressively, with a constructive agenda, that the government will take these ideas on board. But the RPF is a very closed shop when it comes to its ideas, its ideologies. It's very difficult, I think, to shift it and shape it. I, in fact, put a lot more store in the new research and the new intellectual work that's being done by Rwandan researchers in this regard. I think very understandably, given Rwanda's colonial past, a history of outside intervention, it's, I think, justifiably very reluctant about adopting too many ideas from the outside. Where I think there's much more hope is that there is a very important community of domestic scholars, domestic researchers, who are doing the kind of research that outsiders can't do. They speak the language better, they understand the context, and they know how to translate this into the political arena. And so I think that's where, you know, we may start to see some sort of shift in the long term. The role of outsiders, I think, is very circumscribed in this sense.
Okay, thank you. One more question? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Aidan. I'm a master's student in public policy down the street at the Hertie School. Thanks a lot for coming today. Really fascinating talk. So each one of you brings sort of to the panel expertise on different cases where there's been attempts at reconciling the past, albeit with varying levels of determination and success, but attempts nevertheless. On the other hand, there are ideas or examples that come to mind where there have been explicit attempts at not reconciling, not confronting the past, like the Turkish genocide in Armenia or Japanese colonization of China. And so my question is, what are the determinants of what a nation's attitude is going to be after atrocities take place, determining whether or not they're going to try and confront or whether or not they're going to try and avoid what's been done?
Anyone want to take a stab at that? This is a tough one.
I would say that's incredibly variable. It really depends on the circumstances. If you take post-war Germany, Allies were here, and the Allies had a little bit of a say in what Germans were going to have to do about what they'd just done. So, but equally that could then be rejected as victor's justice and all the rest of it. So the interplay between, and we've talked about external imposition a moment ago as well, the interplay between coming from within or imposed from without is a very, very difficult question. I think also you've got to remember it changes over time. I don't know whether you've noticed in the last week or so the Polish government trying to criminalise historians saying that actually some Poles were complicit in hunting Jews and killing Jews and assisted the Nazis. Okay, all Poles were in one sense victims of Nazi occupation, but some Poles nevertheless collaborated with the Nazis and did nasty things, and that is now a criminal offence, or the Polish government is trying to make it such. So we have changes all the time in how particular nations or particular states come to terms with the past. And I think it's also worth remembering that we shouldn't talk in unitary terms as if there's a single actor. If you look at any history of any country, there are multiple competing, contesting voices in ways of trying to deal with different aspects of the past. So it's not just a simple, this has done it this way and that's done it that way.
I would agree entirely with Mary's point that you have to think about different contexts and different nations in very different ways. Generally speaking, I guess we've been assuming that when nations have forgotten their past, that's involved a particular kind of consolidation of the gains of the winners of the past. And I just want to say this one final thing. Maybe sometimes that forgetting of the past may bring its own sting in the tail. My country, which as you know has just distinguished itself by voting for Brexit, has regularly spoken about Brexit as an opportunity to launch something called Empire 2.0. And has, you like this kind of tech jargon, Empire 2.0, with this idea somehow that we can tap into this fondness in the global south for Britain's role in bringing civilization and society to India and China. Now, if you teach Indian and Chinese history in the 19th or the 20th century, you will know that Britain is not remembered fondly. And yet, in our newspapers, in our commentariat, this vision of empire as both positive and kind of nostalgic and available for our post-Brexit future may be its own kind of punishment for forgetting.
I think that's a very good note on which to end. Can we please have a round of applause for our great panel?